honor to welcome you today to peacepodcast.org. I'm Barbara Gahn-Mueller, and I have the privilege of talking to you today about human rights. Do you know that you have 30 human rights? Do you know that we have a World Court of Human Rights? And today we're going to talk to the founder. In 2012, he was nominated and became the founder of the World Court of Human Rights. Now, what does that mean to you? Does that mean that you have, once your human rights are violated, that Mark Oettinger, our guest today, will come and represent you? Let me just go backwards for a little bit. Let's introduce him from the law firm Bio. Mark's international upbringing was influenced in his development of expertise in public and private international law, which remains a cornerstone of his practice today. Mark is one of the handful of lawyers in Vermont knowledgeable in international contracts, customs, immigration, and outbound foreign investments. He also handles both criminal and family matters, including those with international aspects. So today, as we look at the rights that we all have, everyone on earth has certain rights and freedoms. He's a seasoned attorney, educator, author with extensive experience in judicial systems and the rule of law. So Mark, I welcome you to peacepodcast.org.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, I met him through the People Powered Planet, which is an online Wednesday morning show. And I said, holy my goodness, this man has done more for our world that so many of the people we were talking about prior to our podcast today have done. He is right there at the forefront. So Mark, let's just start at the beginning. What is the World Court of Human Rights and what is its function?
Well, the World Court of Human Rights is something that's been discussed since as early as 1947. Which was the year before the United Nations passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's important to understand that the Universal Declaration is not a treaty. It is, in fact, a declaration. But from the declaration have emanated through the United Nations several, some say 9, global in scope human rights conventions, such as the Civil and Political Treaty and the Cultural, Economic, and Social Treaty, the treaty that protects the interests of women, the treaty that protects the interests of children, of indigenous people, a treaty that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race. So it was back in 1948, December 10th, when the UN passed the Universal Declaration, and since that time, any number of human rights treaties, which are in the nature of, we call it public international law. These are basically contractual relationships that are developed between and among nation states. And many of these human rights treaties have been joined by the vast majority of the 195 or so countries in the world now. And so how are people's rights under those conventions adjudicated? And the answer is that in some cases, those rights can be protected through national courts. So we here in the United States could go to our federal court system and argue that to the extent that the U.S. has entered into one or more of these treaties, that it essentially has become domestic U.S. law. And that should carry the day. But to the extent that countries have not joined into these treaties, there are other options, such as the regional courts of human rights. There's one in Europe, there's one for the inter-American system, there's one for the Pan-African system. Currently, there's nothing in Asia, which represents 60% of the world's population, and probably 90% of the world's human rights violations. So the idea behind the World Court of Human Rights would be that it would essentially unify the jurisprudence, in other words, the case law, and the practice worldwide around this body of public international law of human rights, so that the regional courts that currently exist would be augmented by a court in Asia, and that a World Court of Human Rights would sit on top of that and harmonize decisions that come out from the regional courts, and basically continue creating a body of law, a body of decisional case law that would help individuals and groups of individuals, what we call class action individuals, to protect their rights. And so As I said, the conversation began in 1947. There was another effort in the late 1970s, but it was only since 2013 that we, through an international collaboration amongst the academics and international judges and human rights experts, have now created a statute or a blueprint for the World Court of Human Rights. And we're working on trying to get a critical number of nation states to go before the United Nations, tee up conversation about this proposed treaty, and set the World Court of Human Rights finally in motion, 80 years or so beyond, after the Universal Declaration was passed. And so that's basically our mission.
It's a wonderful mission. And is this a new idea for human rights to have a court?
Well, it's an idea that's been thought about for a long time, and some of the pundits ask the question, is the world ready? Are nation states ready to sign on to a treaty that could hold them accountable for violations of human rights in their own countries? You might think that that's kind of a non-starter. But then again, if you look at the body of human rights law currently, you'll find that the vast majority of nation states have signed on to most of the human rights treaties. And so we're trending in a good direction. But no, it's nothing new. But it is also a reflection, I think, of an evolution toward a more global protection of rights that are becoming more sort of globally recognized and more universally, albeit not truly universally at this stage yet, adopted. And so it's something that is, in a sense, of course, 80 years, looking back 80 years is sort of a blink in the eye of, human history. And if you look at the extent of the accession, is the technical term, of nation states to treaties, and especially those regarding human rights, the web of protections, this body of public international law that kind of mimics world law in a sense, is becoming more and more coate. And so I think that if you were to fast forward 80 years into the future, you would find that we would be in a much more protected environment from a human rights standpoint, and we're sort of perhaps halfway on the continuum. And it's an ongoing struggle, but I've seen in the 8 or so years that I've been involved in it, I've seen already a lot of progress.
It's so interesting because you and I have something in common. We both knew Garry Davis. And I know our listeners would love to hear a snippet of how Garry Davis and you met. It's just fascinating.
I was sitting in my office one day, as I am right now, and I got a call from the local federal court. The judge there somebody who had traveled with me to the former Soviet Union on rule of law work. He knew me as an internationalist, and he had before him Garry Davis and another individual, a woman who had arguably been illegal in the United States. She had gone to Canada for medical care. We live right near the Canadian border here in Vermont. And then when she tried to come back after having had her operation, she was denied entry. And so Garry learned of this. He was incensed by it. He was also a pilot from the Second World War, as probably our listeners know. And so he had access to an airplane, and he flew it up to Montreal, and he picked her up, and he brought her back to Vermont. When he came back, he was promptly detained, as was she, and the plane was impounded. And it was essentially an act of political theater, an act of civil disobedience, if you will, as Garry was fond of engaging in. And the prosecutors here, the U.S. Attorney's Office, didn't feel that it was appropriate to prosecute him. But they felt that as a sort of middle ground, they would seek the forfeiture of the aircraft. And the way these things work, I mean, if you use a piece of personal property, like a house, which is real property, but a house, an airplane, in the furtherance of illegal activity, that item can be forfeited to the government. And what happens often is, if there is a forfeitable offense, if you will, that the government will still give the owner of the property an opportunity to get the property back upon the payment of some sort of a penalty, typically 10 or 15 or 20% of the value of the asset. But in that process, and so it's a civil proceeding, so you're technically not entitled to a lawyer at government expense. In this particular case, Judge Sessions issued an order basically appointing me to represent Garry under somewhat unusual circumstances. But Garry decided, as sort of as a further exercise of his political theater, if you will, to essentially decline the option of paying a penalty and getting the aircraft back, but rather letting the government seize the aircraft to demonstrate, let's say, the bankrupt nature of the law in question. He believed in the ability to travel freely across national borders. He cited the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for that purpose. He disregarded essentially immigration rules. He created the world passport. And so that's how I met him. And I believe it was back in 2000. And, he lived in the town next to mine. It's about a 5-minute drive. And we became very close friends. And so through that process, I got to be familiar with his work. And on his deathbed, if you will, at the age of, I think it was 93, he asked me if I would continue part of his legacy. And so I sort of chose from amongst his many activities, the World Court of Human Rights, as that piece that I was willing to pick up and carry forward. And that is precisely what I've done since approximately 2013, having traveled to India 3 times with the World Chief Justice meeting and having worked to create this draft statute, and now being on the precipice, if you will, of getting a critical mass of countries to actually debate the issue in front of the United Nations and hopefully finally create the court.
That is the most wonderful story. As we live our lives, the coincidences that happen, how we meet people right at the moment when they need you there. And the World Criminal Court of Human Rights would never have happened if it wouldn't have been for that moment when he decided that he was going to not do what they wanted. He was going to allow the injustice of this moment to play out fully, and then to invite you to carry on his work. I know his work is still going through the World Service Authority, and I met David Gallup, and he's running this so well. And there was Garry Davis. I always say Garry Davis was one of the bravest heroes on the planet. He was brave. He saw what was the criminal act of shooting other people to bring peace. Is that possible? Think about the logic of that, right?
Well, his experience was as a bomber pilot in World War II. And he was very gung-ho about the whole thing initially. His older brother, whom he idolized, was in the Navy. And so at the earliest opportunity that Garry had, sort of through his sense of patriotism, he volunteered. He entered the Air Force. His brother died in a ship that sank after it was torpedoed. And that really changed Garry's perspective. And also flying over the damaged parts of Dresden, I think it was, parts of Europe, suddenly made Garry realize that by engaging in this war process, he was not serving humanity well. And so he wanted to, on the strength of that, he went to Paris in 1948, when the United Nations was almost brand new, immediately following the Second World War. They did 3 months in Paris, basically as a, almost like a traveling roadshow, if you will. And Garry Davis camped out there, literally, at the doorstep of where they were meeting, drew a huge crowd, including many of the intellectuals of the day, André Gide, Albert Camus, Albert Einstein. The U.S. representative to the United Nations at that time was Eleanor Roosevelt, which ties us back into the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The the Life magazine of the day chronicled when Garry basically disrupted the meeting of the United Nations from the balcony, along with these other like-minded intellectual dissidents, and arguably had the impact of preventing the Soviet Union from using its veto power to stop the enactment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They had threatened to veto it. And just as they still have today, the 5 major member nations all have veto power. for some reason, following Garry's disruption of the events, which they allowed to go on for almost an hour. And so the UN was really affected by his presence. The media picked it up. The next day or the next couple of days, there was a group of 20,000 people that sort of immediately came to a velodrome nearby to hear him speak. I mean, he became an instant sensation. And so perhaps because of his actions, his civil disobedience, the Soviet Union decided not to veto the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and here we are. And so that was the start for Garry of 65 years of advocacy for world order, for world law. And again, when he asked me to sort of pick up the baton, in a sense, that's too much of a big baton. I have a very, very busy practice and many other things that I do. But from amongst the various things that he was so passionate about, I am equally passionate about a World Court of Human Rights. And so that's what I've picked up. And I'm hopeful that perhaps yet during my lifetime, we will be able to see a World Court of Human Rights become a reality. And the naysayers who said, we're not sure that the world is ready yet, perhaps they would be proven wrong.
Well, you know, Garry Davis, as I said, was so verbal. He was a lawyer. He was brilliant. And for him to go to the United Nations and to make a speech was powerful. And, you know, I always quote Maya Angelou, the human voice. Your words are on paper, but when you use your human voice, you change history. He did. He changed the course of the human rights. The Bill of Human Rights, the International Court, I'm hoping we will come into its full potential with your help. You know, people are listening and think, oh, I can't do all this. Garry Davis was brave. Mark's brilliant. What can I do? What's the next step, Mark? What can they do?
So I think what the rank and file individuals can do that are interested in this, that believe in the mission of creating a World Court of Human Rights, they can do two things. One is relatively easy, and one is perhaps more complex. The easy piece is just to sort of spread the word. Talk about it. The more people that know about it, I mean, you mentioned that you and I met on a podcast about a week ago. I take every opportunity that I can find to distribute information about the World Court of Human Rights. For example, there is a website that is www.worldcourtofhumanrights.net, N-E-T. That, you know, spread the word, tell people about that. There's a comment page there. Make comments. I review all of those comments. So spread the word, basically. That's what the rank and file can do. The bigger question is, what we need to do is we need to get the critical number of nation states to essentially promote the World Court of Human Rights through the United Nations Treaty accession process. So there are a number of efforts that we have underway for that purpose. I have met with delegations from India. I have met with our Vermont U.S. congressional delegation. I've met with basically the number 2 in India when I was over there presenting at the meeting of the World Chief Justices. The piece that I'm trying to do in the next number of years that I have left to devote to this is to get the critical number of nation states to actually debate this issue before the United Nations. There are several contexts in the United Nations where that can be done. There's a 3rd committee, there's a 6th committee. There are human rights organs actually within the United Nations. It's just like legislation before the United States Congress. The more sponsors you have for a particular bill, the more influential those sponsors, the greater the likelihood of passing that piece of legislation. And essentially, the incubation of a treaty and the creation of a court system or an international body through that treaty is almost in the nature of creating legislation at the world level. Now, it's a bit of a mixed metaphor because there's obviously not a world level government, so it's not true legislation. But when countries basically adopt treaties, make the law of the treaty their own, recognize the decisions of the treaty body, in this case a World Court of Human Rights, as having the authority of binding decisions within their own country, that's when we are going to actually see a court that will be able to adjudicate issues such as, the plight of 6 million Syrian refugees, or the Rohingya, and how they're being mistreated as a result of their religious beliefs, or the actions of Boko Haram in Nigeria, trying to kidnap and deprive education from girls and women. So those are the two things I think people can do. Number one, spread the word, and number two, I'm not sure exactly how I would say the rank and file can contribute to the likelihood of the United Nations taking this issue up. But I think that if there is enough grassroots activity, it will happen.
Yes, I'm with you. Go back a second and repeat the website.
It's www.worldcourtofhumanrights.net.
.net. Okay, worldcourtofhumanrights.net. Mark has made the point, and so did Garry, by standing up there in the balcony at the United Nations, pleading with Russia to approve the International Court, not the court, but the International Bill of Human Rights. I don't remember Eleanor Roosevelt because I was pretty young, but my husband was an intern at the United Nations the day that they approved it. I think it was like midnight. And they walked out with such happiness in their voices. And the media said, this is a document we can throw in the trash. And my husband, an intern, again, voice, said, mark my words, this will be the most translated document on the planet besides the Bible. And it is, Mark, it is the most translated volume of people and document of our human rights. Now, if you say to somebody, do you know how many human rights you have? Most people don't even know that. The International Law of Human Rights, we have 30 human rights. Read about them. Go to www. Again, let's have that website, Mark, so we can get 3 times is what Edward Bernays, the founder of PR, said before somebody really gets it.
worldcourtofhumanrights.net.
All right. If you don't know your human rights, I'm going to ask you to go to peacepodcast.org. In the comments section of our app, write down, I would like to have the document about the human rights, and I will send it to you. No cost, nothing. And you can go to unasb.org and you can see all of the human rights along with the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm Barbara Gahn-Mueller. With your help, with the listeners' help, we can create a world that works for all. We can create a culture of peace. And I thank you for listening. Get the app. Let us hear from you. Mark told the truth. I wrote in the comments section of his website, and there he climbed right back to me and said, I'm glad you wrote. He is honest. He will tell you what you need to hear. I'm Barbara Gahn-Mueller saying, please join us again next week. Peacepodcast.org is here for you to become active, to work with the International Court of Human Rights, which will eventually happen. There's Ben Ferencz, who worked with the wonderful Nuremberg trial. These are people who are making a difference. We have 80 plus members of our world who are telling you that peace is possible. I thank you for listening. Join us again next week. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Barbara. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. God bless you. All right, people, it's up to us. Not you, not me, but all of us as a world that works for all. Thank you for joining us today.